The year is 2025, and the single most important financial agreement in modern economic history just quietly and formally expired. If you are not paying very close attention right now, you are about to watch the intrinsic value of your savings, your paycheck, and your entire standard of living collapse in real time. For 50 consecutive years, every single barrel of crude oil sold anywhere on Earth, regardless of the seller or the buyer, was priced exclusively in US dollars. Every developing nation, every industrial power, from Japan to Germany, from Brazil to China, had one mandatory requirement. They needed to acquire dollars just to secure their most essential energy supply. This vital, mandatory necessity created an absolutely enormous and completely artificial demand for the American currency. This artificial demand was the true hidden engine that made the United States the single most powerful nation on Earth. It granted us geopolitical and economic privileges that were simply unprecedented in human history. This extraordinary power was ours, even though the U.S. currently produces almost nothing compared to its consumption and owes trillions upon trillions to the rest of the world. But that entire half-century system has just ended, and no major media outlet is giving you the full, unvarnished story. Your politicians and central bankers are not warning you about the true, critical severity of the situation. If you knew what was actually happening behind the closed doors of global finance, you would understand that the America you grew up in is already gone. The Petrodollar agreement dies in 2025, and the very moment it dies, the dollar's global dominance dies alongside it. Most people will be completely blindsided by the speed of the coming crisis, but the smart money already moved its assets into hard holdings years ago. Let us return to the genesis of this problem. It didn't start today. It was born in August of 1971. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television for a dramatic and world-altering announcement. He officially told the entire world that the United States was temporarily closing the gold window. This decision was, in financial history, an act of betrayal against the post-war Bretton Woods Agreement. Translation: the dollar was no longer convertible into gold at a fixed price. It instantly became backed by nothing more substantial than printed paper and a rapidly depreciating promise by the U.S. government. Nixon's administration and the Federal Reserve understood the profound gravity and danger of this action. They asked themselves a terrifying question. If the dollar is just unsecured paper, why would any foreign government or central bank continue to accept it? Why would they hold billions upon billions of dollars in their national reserves? The crucial, cynical answer arrived exactly 4 years later, in 1974. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to the Middle East and engineered a deal with the highly conservative monarchy of Saudi Arabia. It was a simple exchange, a brilliant strategic move that was utterly evil in its geopolitical implications. Saudi Arabia, the world's most powerful oil exporter, agreed to price all of its massive oil sales exclusively in US dollars. They would not accept payment in euros, yen, or physical gold. Only US currency would suffice. In return for this financial compliance, the United States guaranteed the eternal survival and security of the Saudi regime. We provided them with comprehensive military protection and sold them the most advanced weaponry without question. Crucially, through the mechanism of OPEC, this foundational deal quickly extended its reach to virtually every major oil-producing nation on Earth. This cycle, oil for dollars, dollars for oil, created the artificial, inescapable global demand that cemented American economic hegemony for 5 straight decades. Because the world had to buy dollars to secure oil, foreign central banks were effectively cornered into buying massive amounts of U.S. Treasury bonds. They bought our debt because they desperately needed a safe place to hold their massive piles of compulsory dollar reserves. This became the unparalleled sacred privilege of the petrodollar system. The U.S. government was handed the keys to print unlimited amounts of money at will. We could run massive, perpetual trade deficits and accrue trillions in national debt without ever facing market consequences. The mandatory global necessity of the dollar meant we never had to worry about the actual sustainability of our domestic debt. Our trade partners were unilaterally forced to finance the enormous deficits we created through endless wars and welfare programs. The petrodollar system granted us the ability to export our inflation, effectively pushing the cost of our reckless spending onto every other global economy. We imported cheap goods and allowed the rest of the world to foot the bill for maintaining our massive, globe-spanning military empire. This system was the unquestionable foundation of American global power, exceeding the importance of our military, our technology, or our democratic values. It was the economic engine that gave the United States a free pass for half a century, and that free pass has just been revoked. For 50 long years, this global architecture of power worked without fail. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency, not because of American productivity or gold reserves, but because of the inescapable necessity of oil. Every central bank on the planet dutifully held dollars in reserve. They bought U.S. Treasury bonds because they needed a safe place to park their currency. But here is the critical fact that was deliberately withheld from you. That entire agreement had a hard, non-negotiable expiration date, and we just hit it. In a move that generated almost no mainstream headlines, Saudi Arabia quietly announced in 2023 they would not renew the petrodollar agreement with the United States. It was not front-page news on major networks. There was no public debate in Congress. But in the world's most critical financial circles and among the leadership of central banks, everyone knows the economic foundation has cracked. Once a currency system built entirely on confidence and compulsion starts to fracture, the collapse accelerates with terrifying speed. Saudi Arabia and its partners are not waiting for Washington's next move. They have been preparing for this inevitable financial divorce for over a decade. They joined the BRICS Economic Alliance, which was specifically designed to be the counterweight to the dollar's global dominance. They are now aggressively accepting the Chinese yuan for oil sales to Beijing and actively discussing accepting the Indian rupee for sales to New Delhi. These strategic moves are designed to surgically reduce every aspect of their dependence on the U.S. currency. And the Saudis are far from alone in this global transition. Look at the evidence, because the scale of de-dollarization is staggering and undeniable. In the year 2000, roughly 73% of all global foreign exchange reserves were held securely in U.S. dollars. By 2020, that number had dramatically fallen to 59%. And today, in 2024, that percentage is sinking rapidly below 55%. In the critical, high-stakes world of reserve currencies, a decline of this magnitude is considered an irreversible free fall. Central banks globally are rushing to diversify out of dollar-denominated assets at the fastest pace seen since the end of World War II. China, a massive holder of our national debt, has reduced its U.S. Treasury holdings by over $300 billion since 2021. Russia, following sanctions, dumped nearly all of its dollar reserves immediately and has been aggressively stockpiling physical gold and foreign currencies instead. Countries are now conducting bilateral trade in their own domestic currencies, completely bypassing the dollar entirely. The world is finally waking up to the critical, simple truth: the emperor has no clothes. The dollar is backed by nothing substantial, only the promise that billions of people will remain deluded enough to keep accepting it. When that essential promise breaks, the currency's purchasing power evaporates instantly. Here is the personal, inescapable consequence. This is not about distant geopolitics or abstract central bank policy. This crisis is about your ability to secure your paycheck and afford basic food next year. The dollar's illusory strength is based solely on the artificial global demand created by the petrodollar system. When that mandatory global demand suddenly disappears, the supply of dollars does not change. We have printed trillions and trillions over the last 2 decades. All those trillions of unwanted dollars will come flooding back home to the United States. This is called inflationary shock. And it will not be the managed 6% or 8% inflation you have been tolerating lately. It will be a systemic financial catastrophe that destroys the middle class's savings, wealth, and pensions in a matter of months. For 5 decades, the world absorbed our inflation for us, acting as a financial sponge. Now they are selling their reserves, repatriating their profits, and getting out before the door slams shut. When those dollars return home, the purchasing power of your remaining money collapses overnight. The price of every import explodes. The cost of gas, electronics, clothing, medicine, everything manufactured outside the U.S. becomes fundamentally and permanently unaffordable. This inflation is coming home to roost. The government and the Federal Reserve are utterly powerless to stop this unfolding financial disaster. Their traditional tools, like interest rate hikes, are completely useless when the core problem is a catastrophic loss of reserve currency status. They could raise rates drastically, but that would instantly crash the entire U.S. economy and make our $36 trillion national debt immediately and violently unsustainable. They could try to print more money to cover the debt, but that action would only accelerate hyperinflation and drive the last few remaining countries away from the dollar. The political elite recognize the severity of the dilemma. It is a checkmate scenario with no viable path forward. That is precisely why they are not discussing this crisis openly or honestly. In their cynical view, it is better to keep the public calm, distracted, and ignorant, allowing the disaster to unfold slowly enough that panic does not accelerate the final collapse. But the smart money, the most well-informed financial actors on Earth, already saw the inevitable writing on the wall years ago. When the world's billionaires change their investment behavior, that is your final, loudest warning sign. The wealthiest people on the planet are currently buying vast amounts of American farmland. Bill Gates, for instance, now owns more farmland than any single individual in the United States. They do this because land produces food, and food is a fundamental asset that retains its value regardless of the fate of any paper currency. Ray Dalio, one of the world's most successful hedge fund managers, has been screaming about the coming dollar collapse for years, allocating massive portions of his fund to physical gold and foreign assets. Meanwhile, central banks globally, including Russia, China, India, and Turkey, are buying physical gold at record, unprecedented levels. They understand that when the dollar's reserve status ends, hard, tangible assets like gold survive, while paper currencies utterly fail. The end of the petrodollar is not the final collapse. It is merely the opening move, the first critical domino to fall in a predictable sequence. Here is the inevitable cascade you must prepare for. First, the oil-producing nations begin accepting other currencies, surgically reducing global dollar demand. Second, countries holding massive dollar reserves begin panic selling their U.S. treasuries, desperately trying not to be the last ones holding the worthless debt. Third, this rush of selling causes interest rates to spike violently, making the massive U.S. government debt instantly unsustainable. Fourth, the government is left with only one desperate choice: printing catastrophic amounts of money to pay the interest on the skyrocketing debt. Fifth, printing money accelerates hyperinflation, which immediately obliterates public and international confidence in the currency itself. This financial crisis will trigger a debt crisis, which will inevitably trigger a banking crisis, and finally, a devastating political and social crisis. You must internalize that this has happened before, hundreds of times. Every single global reserve currency in history eventually fails and disappears. The Spanish silver dollar collapsed. The Dutch guilder collapsed. The British pound sterling collapsed. The dollar has been the world's reserve since 1944. At 80 years, we have already exceeded the average lifespan of most reserve currencies. Every single failure followed the exact same script: overextension, massive, unrepayable debt, currency debasement, and finally, loss of confidence. The dollar is not an exception. It is not special. It is simply next in line to the grave. The people who see this pattern coming have a chance to prepare, adapt, and survive. The people who ignore it will learn the same brutal lesson millions have learned before them. Paper money always dies, but hard assets always survive. The answers to what happens next are not hiding in some uncertain future. They are written clearly and violently in the past. The dollar's reign is ending, not due to bad luck, but because of mathematical inevitability and historical patterns that have repeated for thousands of years. The question was never if this would happen, the question was always when, and the answer is now. The petrodollar just died, and the foundation of the empire has cracked wide open. Are you ready?
If you want to understand how to protect yourself and your family in a world where the rules are written by the predators, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. The pattern is clear, history is the map, and I'll show you exactly where to look.